Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Grandfather's statue. This happened a few years ago when I was younger and still in school. Be me. 17 years old and still living with my parents in Massachusetts while I began veterinary school. I was the only boy in my family and I had two older sisters who were attending college out of state at the time. My family wasn't very religious growing up, but my mother grew up in a strict Catholic home and my grandparents were the religious type. Going to church every Sunday and saying prayers before bed. That sort of thing. My grandparents lived in a suburb on the outskirts of Boston and had an top-floor apartment in an old three-family building. They were both in their 80s and were in the process of moving into a nursing, assisted living home and needed help moving out. My mother asked me to help them when I wasn't studying so they didn't injure themselves during the move. I used to see them almost every weekend growing up, but didn't get to spend much time with them now that I was in school with a life of my own and had a steady girlfriend. I thought it would be a great idea spending some time with them now that they're older since hadn't seen me in a while. The day I showed up at my grandparents' apartment, they were taken back with how much I had grown since I last saw them. It had been about 4 years since they saw me, and I was about 6 foot and just under 200 pounds, so they were pleased to know I would be helping them with all the heavy lifting required to move their belongings out of the apartment. My grandfather was a collector of antiques and always had all sorts of trinkets and cool things on display to check out all over their home. One of them was a medium-sized porcelain statue about 4 feet tall that looked like an old Russian doll replica that in hindsight reminds me of that Annabelle doll from movies I had watched when I was younger. Grandfather asked if I would be interested in taking the statue home because he felt bad selling it. This is when I should have seen a red flag, but I knew my grandfather wouldn't be around much longer and thought it would be cool to have something of his to remember him by after he passed on. I agreed to taking the statue and brought it back to my parents' house and stood it up next to the fish tank in my bedroom across the hall from my parents' room. Things were fine the first few nights, but I began having odd dreams about the statue and it would show up in my dreams often. I chalked this up to the fact that it was one of the last things I would see before going to bed and didn't think much of it. After about a week, I noticed all of the fish in the tank would always be on the opposite side of the tank from the statue. One day after school, I came home to find that all of the fish in the tank were dead and floating on the water's surface. I thought my parents may have overfed them, but they said they hadn't gone in my room because they wanted me to have my own privacy. That night I had another dream about the statue, but this time it was alive and was trying to follow me. It would try to hold my hand like I was its older brother and would say things to me quietly in an almost indistinguishable voice like an adult trying to speak like a child. In the dream I asked it to leave me alone, which it didn't like, and it felt like it was mad at me for ignoring it. Later that week, strange things started to happen in my parents' house. Things would go missing and turn up in weird, unexplainable places. The weirdest was when my father didn't find his keys on the rack in the kitchen and blamed me and my mother for misplacing them. We ended up finding the keys in our cat's litter box and my dad blamed me for putting them there. Things went on like this for another week, and is when I began feeling strange in my bedroom, like the statue was watching me. I told my mother about how I felt and she said my grandfather had a habit of collecting some things that he said had spirits trapped inside. I asked her about the statue and she said it belonged to a woman who lived in the same apartment building that my grandparents lived in, and he offered to buy it at her estate sale after she passed away. The woman's daughter wouldn't accept any money from my grandfather and asked him to take it since he and her mother were close friends who used to chat a lot in passing since they lived in the same building. My mother said the statue could be another relic of my grandfather's that had some sort of weird spirit association, but I thought that sort of thing to be crazy at the time. One morning I woke up after a bad dream and told my mother that something isn't right with the statue. It showed up in my dream again and was asking me to take it somewhere. When I said no, it got angry and told me that I would be sorry if I didn't help it. My mother believed me and said she would camp out on the sofa in my room when I was sleeping to see if it was all in my mind or my imagination. That night I went to bed with my mom on the sofa in the side of my room. By then I had laid the statue on its back so it wouldn't be faced towards us when we were sleeping. When I awoke that night, the statue was sitting upright and looking at me with those big black and white eyes. I moved to the end of my bed and it turned its head watching me as I got closer to where my mom was sleeping. My mother woke up when the room began to shake almost like an earthquake and she asked what was happening. When I turned to where I had laid the statue, it was missing and I thought it may have fallen to the ground due to all of the vibrations. Something made me turn around and when I did I saw the statue standing in the middle of my bed smiling at me. It was fully animated and was just staring at me with an evil grin. I got mad and tried walking towards it with the intent to hit it or something but was unable to get close, almost like there was a field between the statue and I. The room began shaking again and I woke up realizing it had all been another dream. When I asked my mother what she remembered from the night before, she recounted the events from a dream she was having almost exactly as they happened in my dream. I asked her if we should throw the statue away or destroy it, but she said if a spirit was inside it would make me feel bad because it was a gift from my grandfather. She suggested giving it back to my grandfather and to tell him what's been happening and the reason I didn't want it anymore. The next day I loaded the statue into my parents' car and brought it back to my grandparents' house. I told my grandfather what had happened and he was okay taking it back. They had a realtor over that day showing their apartment to new potential tenants, and the realtor brought her son with her who was about my age and was learning to become a real estate agent like his mother. I told him that I didn't want to spend any more time in the apartment and he offered to take me down the street to a park where we could let off some steam and talk to the local girls. We headed back to my grandparents' house about an hour later and I realized that I had 3 ticks on my clothes from the park and was freaking out. My father had Lyme disease when I was growing up, so the thought of getting that always bothered me. When we got back to the main hallway of my grandparents' apartment building, I began removing my shirt and asked the realtor's son if he could scan me for any ticks that might still be on me. He didn't see anything and I went up to my grandparents' apartment with the plan to do a thorough check in the bathroom to make sure there weren't any of those blood-sucking assholes under my clothes. When we arrived at my grandparents' apartment, there were a couple other groups of people there checking the unit out. Someone was in the bathroom and when they got out I immediately went in to continue my search for any ticks that may still be clinging onto me. My grandparents' bathroom was old and they had a bath towel hanging up on the door on the inside of the room. After about 5 minutes of checking myself, I felt better after not finding any but realized the rest of my shirt was still on the chair outside of the bathroom next to the door. I reached for the bathroom door handle to exit the bathroom. Something grabbed my wrist with 2 hands from behind the hanging bath towel and I screamed in horror, thinking someone was hiding behind the towel, which made no sense since I didn't see anyone's legs under the towel. I continued screaming until my grandfather came in to see what was happening and he saw me on the floor next to the bathtub as white as a sheet. When I told him what happened, he said it could just be my imagination, but he couldn't explain the red burn-like mark on my wrist where I felt the hands grab me. I was convinced it was the spirit in the statue and it was upset because I brought it back to my grandparents' home and didn't want it anymore. My grandparents ended up moving out of the apartment about a week later and I was told a developer had bought the building and others on the street with the intention to level them all in order to build a strip mall. I'm not sure what happened to the statue, but I hope it doesn't affect anyone else the way it affected me that summer.
I see some weird shit in Arizona. I've got a place right on the edge of the desert down in the valley, and a really nice concrete cabin right on the edge of the forest in Flagstaff. One thing both have in common are coyotes. There are shitloads of coyotes that live right on the edges of civilization. They thrive there, scavenging and eating people's pets. When I'm in the valley, I like to go on walks during full moons. It's so bright outside that you can see almost perfectly, and the sun isn't beating you down constantly. This was one such night, and I decided to go out. I followed the washout to the canal, which has 3 trails next to it that extend out into the desert, and I decided to take the one that meanders out away from the canal into the wilderness proper. After a mile or so, the trail does a 90-degree turn when it meets the Indian reservation border. You're not supposed to go in there, but people do all the time. The views were spectacular. Nothing like seeing the red rock formations on the horizon with that pale moon glow to them. I didn't like the idea of taking my eyes off the scenery in order to navigate through the desert, so I stayed on the trail. I could hear a pack of coyotes pretty close by, doing their crazy howling yipping thing they do when they tear a cat apart or something. I didn't care. Coyotes are pussies, and they never attack humans. I kept walking, scanning the horizon for owls or something else interesting. I look over the shoddy barbed wire fence that's a border to the reservation, and I see a pack of coyotes not 200 feet away. There are lots of fairly deep dips in the trail, so it makes sense that I didn't see them until now. I freeze to watch, and the moonlight illuminates things pretty clearly for me, in a colorless way. I notice one of the coyotes seems way bigger than the other ones. More than that, it looks really fucked up and isn't moving properly. At first I think it's a dead dog or something and they're eating it, which made sense, the way they were all milling around in a circle around it. I stared with morbid curiosity as the coyotes seemed to take turns looking back at me. Then the thing stands up, which scared the shit out of me, thinking it was dead. And even more because it stood on its hind legs, and was at least 5 feet tall. As it raised its arms into the air, I realized that this was a person, or at least looked like one. He was wearing coyote pelts all over his body, and was carrying some darkly colored dead animal in one of his hands that coyotes kept leaping and trying to get at as he raised it into the air. I had no fucking idea what to do at that point. I knew coyotes weren't really dangerous, but this guy was obviously completely insane. He was inside the reservation, so I guessed he had to be a native doing some crazy goddamn Indian thing. I'd only been standing there a few seconds at this point, when he realized his coyotes were looking at something, and turned towards me. The moonlight wasn't enough to make out his face, and it was shadowed by pelts anyway. He just stared at me for a second or two as the coyotes walked in circles around him, looking at him, then looking at me, then at him again. He turned away from me and bolted into the desert, sprinting and jumping and doing a nearly perfect coyote yipping noise, which started the rest of them doing it. I should mention you cannot sprint through the desert around here. It's goddamn minefield of chala cactus that don't give a fuck what kind of footwear you have on. Even if you put on heavy boots, within 30 seconds you'd be walking on little lopsided islands of spines that are stuck to your feet and just begging you to lift your foot high enough to brush against your other leg's calf. I never made a habit of going onto the reservation. There are stories of natives riding up and escorting trespassers out at gunpoint. But I don't know what the fuck I saw that night. I think about it every single time I hear the coyotes go apeshit.
The middle school I attended was once the first high school built in the downtown area of my hometown in the early 20th century. Comprised of 3 main halls, a gymnasium and a large office building where the library and auditorium were located. At this time, my mother worked in the main office and would work through the summer while students and teachers were gone. On one such day, she was in her office alone when she heard the front door open and the sound of a group of children walking toward the office. She called out with her normal friendly demeanor, expecting them to round the corner any moment. Instead, she heard the door to the auditorium open and the sounds go with it. Now thinking some children were where they were not supposed to be, she quickly got up and walked into the auditorium to tell them to leave. She was confronted with only empty and lonely seats and the dark, unlit stage. Feeling uneasy, she began her exit, and as she did, she heard a child giggle somewhere in the darkness. Shortly after, she was again in the office alone when suddenly she heard a loud banging coming from the library above her. Worried but dutiful, she made her way up the stairs and opened the door to the library. Every chair and table was tossed and tipped aside haphazard and cluttered. Scared and annoyed, she quickly reset everything and made her exit. She would go on to complain for weeks about this repeating in that location. The final and most extreme of her experiences happened in the office. She was filing paperwork and organizing things for the assistant principal, who was not on school premises at the time. She was walking back and forth between her office, the conference room, and the assistant principal's office. She had just walked into the conference room and felt a sharp and aggressive tug on the back of her head. She whirled around expecting to see an assailant, but there was nothing. Determined to stand her ground, she mustered up her courage and shouted out that she would not be bullied or made afraid and that she had work to do, as if reprimanding a child. After which things calmed down in that building. The 8th grade hall was a whole other matter entirely. The summer going into 7th grade, we decided to do a little ghost hunting of our own. A trio comprised of myself, my mother, and my grandfather entered the empty hall in the late afternoon. We sat on the old steps in silence for a while, looking down the hall with our backs to the entry to the girls' gym. After a while, we began to hear what sounded like footsteps on the old basketball court in the girls' gym. Startled but excited, we quietly walked into the empty gym. The court creaked and whined as we walked across it until we came to a halt in the middle and just stood there for a minute. An eerie feeling came over us and a creaking began to sound from the court, as if footsteps were circling around us. Feeling uneasy, we began our exit. As we opened the double doors of the gym into the main hall, all three of us looked down at the end of the hall that connects the 7th and 8th grade halls together and saw a tall, thin and inky black figure swiftly glide across from right to left and out of sight. Filled with hormonal courage, I charged down the hallway towards it, but by the time I reached the end of the hall, there was nothing to be seen. Freaked out, we called it a day. Sometime later, after school hours, I had just finished training with the track and field team and was walking up to the main office where my mother was. As I was walking, I began to hear a loud and repetitive banging noise. Confused, I looked around for the source. I looked up and through the high windows of the girls' locker room, could see a single locker door opening and slamming shut repetitively with force by itself. I stood there for a minute in bemusement, thinking it was a vent or something causing it, but no other locker doors near it moved. It continued to slam loudly as I made my way to the office. I don't know when it stopped. The final tale I have from this location is the one that creeps me out the most. Over summer going into 8th grade, while the buildings were mostly empty, a group of electricians and custodians were tasked with climbing up into the crawl space above the 8th grade hall to solve a problem. They were going about their casual conversation in the front office where my mom was, drinking coffee and laughing as she heard them exit and head to the hall. About 20 minutes passes and she says they all enter the main office. None of them are talking, no laughing. Their entire demeanor now off. These big burly man's men are now pale as paper and are avoiding eye contact with her. She approaches the main custodian, a friendly, usually candid older gentleman, and asks him what's wrong. He brushes her off in a somewhat rude manner that nothing is wrong and that they're just working some things out. 2 years pass and none of those men will speak a word about it until one day my mother confronts the main custodian, demanding what made him act so craven that day. He breaks and finally tells her. Says that he and a few of the guys went up into the crawl space that day. That they had been working up for 10 minutes when they saw something. Something that scared these men so badly that they would rather be reprimanded for not doing the job than go back up there. Men who pride themselves on their integrity, turning away from their responsibility out of fear of what was up there. When she pressed him for more details, he refused and told her to drop it. Never speaking about it ever again.
When I was a young child, 3 to 5 years old, my father moved around a lot. He is ex-military and at the time had just settled into his second marriage and moved into a house in Idaho. I remember how excited I was the first time I saw it. A real house, not an apartment or manufactured home, but a real house, old and sturdy. The thing that struck out to me the most was its paint job, snow white over the old wooden paneling, and scarlet red stairs leading up to a large black door. Something about the red stairs weirded me out, but I was so excited because it was a big house, in a town I liked and was given a room all to myself. Weeks passed and by the way my dad tells it, little things began to happen. He would stay up late in the night, and when he would get ready for bed, would notice the basement light peeking through the old black wood floors. He would go down there and turn the lights off, only to be confronted by the light shining through the floorboards upon reaching the top of the stairs. This little game continued on and off for a few weeks, with his frustration and concern growing. Then one day something happened that changed the atmosphere of the house completely. It was around midday, and I was in my room with a friend from school. We were playing with the realistic little animal toys you could usually find in a craft store. My father's wife came in to tell us that the boy's mother was outside waiting to take him home. We said our goodbyes and I heard them exit the house. I began to clean up the toys that I usually kept in my closet. As I turned to carry the box of toys into the closet, I looked up out the window and into the garden where my father and stepmother were having a conversation. Alone in my room, and my back to the door, I placed the box in the closet and began rummaging through more toys. That is when I felt 2 large hands on my upper back. A powerful shove sent me tumbling into the closet, and the door slammed shut behind me. Alone in the dark, I could hardly comprehend what was happening when I felt a horrible and overwhelming sense of dread, and a strong compulsion to not turn around. I began to do what most kids would do, scream and cry. My dad heard my panicking screams from outside and charged into the house and bolted into my room. Grabbing the closet door and attempting to open it to no avail, he began to beat on the doors, shattering them with his strength and commanding whatever it was to release them. Then, as if nothing had happened, the doors just opened. After this, the house seemed to become darker. It felt colder. A looming sense of dread, or being watched, began to grow, and none of us liked being alone in the house anymore. My father, who is a fervent believer in Christ, began to want to talk about it and spend much more time in the workshop or outside, hoping that denying the situation might solve it. My stepmother took to a different approach. She took to spending most of her time in the kitchen and began reading about cleansing the house. She eventually saged the house with my father's permission while he was at work. After that, things seemed to go somewhat neutral. Months passed and I left to visit my mother. Upon returning to the house, I no longer felt the excitement I once did. The feelings of pride that such a lovely home was ours was replaced by dread of walking up those scarlet stairs and looking down at the dark hallway by my room. I could tell things had gotten worse, but my father wouldn't allow discussion of it, until one night, the final straw broke. According to my dad, he woke in the night and got up to get some water, figuring he would check on me. In the process, he walked to my room and opened the door to see me, his son, standing on my bed, with my eyes rolled back into my head. Nothing but the whites showing. Wondering something, but audibly speaking anything, and my arms jutting out in a stiff manner. Terrified, he grabbed me off my bed and immediately began praying and commanding whatever it was to leave me in the name of Christ. Shortly after that experience, we moved into my grandparents for a short while. 20 years later, and my father is surprised I remember these events with such detail, given that I was so young. It is still talked about in a hushed tone. The only thing my dad will really say about it is that he thinks I was making the sign of the cross on my body, but he always described it like I was making more of an arrow with my body. I have some theories of my own, but would like some thoughts and opinions as well as to the whole wording but not speaking when it happened. Hello everyone, my name is Ghosty-Mist. Over on my channel, my videos consist of true scary stories and stories that were submitted by subscribers. I hope to see you over there.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.